My name is Maria Johansson, and I'm also part of this Prosperous Forest project. I'm also a researcher at SLU, and my main focus in my research in general circles around issues related to gender equality, for example, and gender equal organizational development. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to how we in this project kind of our entry point for understanding inclusivity in relation to service development. And traditionally, when we think of a forest owner or forestry professional, there has been a quite narrow image of who comes to mind. And we have perhaps a picture of a middle-aged man who has a forest property in the family, and he might be interested in hunting or outdoor activities. Maybe he rides a snowmobile in wintertime, and it's probably quite pale skin and talks the native language without much of an accent. And I deliberately say he as well, because this perception of who is the forest person is a very gendered image. And at the same time, we know both from research and from experiences that forest owners is a much more diverse group, and also forestry professionals is a much more diverse group than that. And nevertheless, these kind of norms still prevail, and these narrow norms also risks being reflected in how companies act and communicate when it comes to who the company targets, and this is in turn kind of also affecting how the company's way of working. And as a service provider, norms influence who is perceived as a co-worker or a customer or a collaborator, and hence also influence what is perceived as a service. To put it differently, whose needs is this service going to meet? And this is kind of our entry point when we argue that applying this inclusivity perspective is a crucial aspect in service development. And that kind of leads us also to the next question, that what is inclusion? And as an employer, you have in Sweden the responsibility to not only take action when discrimination occurs, but also to, through proactive measures, prevent discrimination. And strategic inclusion work, we argue, can be a tool for making sure that your organization is proactive rather than reactive when it comes to equal opportunities. But it can also be a strategic tool or perspective in organizational development work. And this may sound a bit complicated, but it doesn't have to be that hard to get started, because what it all comes down to is maybe that you as an entrepreneur can reach a larger customer base. You can develop different kind of services and reach more or different or more specific partners if you add this perspective of inclusion on your everyday organizational practices. And that sounds easy enough, but then how do we do it? I am, during this presentation, very briefly going to touch upon three different aspects that we deem as central to inclusion. And that is reflection, the choices you make, and accessibility. And we kind of aim to inspire to think a bit further on how inclusion can, how this perspective can contribute to both the kind of organization that you work with, but also to organizations that you meet, depending on in which capacity that you are here today, I imagine that many of you are perhaps not forest service providers or entrepreneurs in the traditional sense, but rather meet meet this kind of businesses and individuals in a more kind of supportive capacity, perhaps, or as an advisor and so on. So maybe you can get some food for thought to bring along to your next interactions with service providers or forest entrepreneurs. Anyway, the first step to reflect. We argue that this is kind of the first aspect of getting started on working on these issues, and to really ask yourself critical questions and also answer them honestly. And these questions that can kind of be a starting point for reflection is in regards to what your business looks like today, what your goal with your business is, if it's the right goal, or if you can kind of adjust it in order to kind of push your organization further. We argue for posing questions in regards to what is implied or taken for granted when thinking about your organizations. Whose needs do you have in mind in product and service development today, and whose conditions and abilities influence and control the way your organizations work today, and can that be kind of adjusted in order to meet the needs of tomorrow? And based on what it is that you deliver, and based on your needs and opportunities for business development, one really important question to ask oneself is also the question of who is relevant for you and to whom are you relevant. And increasing awareness of these issues and what is taken for granted can help kind of make visible the obvious aspects of an organization, that you can kind of the issues that don't need to be explained is often a good entry point to explore when thinking about who is not currently included in our organization and in our business. And from there you can kind of revise your goals and also plan for action in relation to that. The second aspect that we would like to encourage for service providers to think about is the choices that you make as an entrepreneur or an organizational leader, because you make every day, both consciously and unconsciously, a lot of choices every day, and it can regard which kind of communication channels you choose to reach out through, which forums you use to kind of build relationship with other actors, and how you invite people to your organization, and all those choices have consequences, both large and small, and it can be a quite good idea to reflect upon whether you have taken if you choose by deliberately, or if it's just out of habit. And if you imagine a service provider wanting to reach out to new customers, then maybe the forest magazine that everyone in the industry already reads isn't the most effective way for you to reach out through, because the risk is that audience already knows about you, and they would hire you or not hire you regardless of your kind of communicative efforts. So perhaps there are other choices to be made in order to reach out to customers, for example. The second step or aspect regards accessibility. How available are your organization? And this aspect addresses issues in terms of what kind of knowledge and information and pre-understanding that both potential customers or potential co-workers need to be able to take part in your offer or in your activities. And perhaps there are certain groups that have directly or indirectly more difficulties in being able to take your offer or your activities into use, into practice. And for example, imagine if you want to invite for a study visit for your customers and their families. You need to think about what kind of information has been shared. Do you have a specific start and stop time for the event? Is there access to a toilet? Is there possibilities to change diapers on babies if you want to invite families? In what kind of environment is this event held? Is it in the office or out in the field? And does that require boots, for example, or is sneakers fine? Is it possible to kind of access your event in a wheelchair or with a baby stroller? And are there kind of clear instructions on how to find your event, for example? And much of what is obvious or implied to the ones already initiated may need to be clarified in order not to be an obstacle for potential new customers or partners that doesn't have the same frame of references. And in regard to accessibility or availability, there are a lot of checklists and do's and don'ts that you can easily find online. For example, if you search for inclusive meeting or so on, you can find a lot of easy checklists. But for example, can say that you should consider what language to use, avoid using specific concepts or acronyms that are maybe difficult to understand, what kind of cultural competence or pre-understandings is used in order to understand jargon, for example. Are the different kind of communication support needs that needs to be met? Is this available for someone with dyslexia or with a hearing deficiencies, for example? But also in a less practical sense, that please avoid reinforcing stereotypes, making jokes on or comments on the kind of behalf of different social groups and so on. Don't assume that all you meet are heterosexual or make assumptions about knowledge levels based on accents or skin colors and so on. And there are a lot of great kind of checklist tools, but I'm gonna finish on a little bit different note. We argue that inclusion is a process. Please use checklists and can be found and so on, but most of all, keep in mind that inclusion maybe mostly is a perspective that should guide everyday life and a process that is rooted in empathy and ambitions for mutual learning and a kind of strive to meet every individual where they are and I believe that we can enrich both businesses and services, but also individuals in themselves if we keep this perspective rather than checklists. But please use inclusion in both ways. But we argue that it's quite useful as a kind of more underlying perspective in service development.